Frank Hermann is a longtime EAH member and has worked on the development of airports in Hawaii and the Pacific for over 50 years. Frank's talk was recorded in 2 parts. In Part 1, Frank talks about airports in Hawaii. Frank arrived in Hawaii in 1966 to review the siting for the planned new airport for Kona on the Big Island. He then worked with Owen Miyamoto, another longtime EAH member, on the Honolulu new Reef Runway and other projects. Frank credits Owen's forward-looking airport design goals that prepared Honolulu's airport for the new generation of jumbo jets, starting with the Boeing 747. Frank concludes Part 1 on Hawaii airports at Kauai's Lihue Airport and its second runway. In Part 2, Frank covers the development of airports in Majuro Atoll, Kozri Island, Pohnpei, Truk, and Guam. Frank finishes with talking about developing airports in Saipan, Yap, Palau, Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and Taipei, Taiwan.
All right, aloha and welcome everyone to the first meeting of our 2023-24 EAH year. I'm Barbara Rogers. I am privileged to serve as your first VP, and I'm in for our president, Kanan Sean, who couldn't be here with us today. Just a little bit about myself. I found EAH through Philip Blackman, very long time friend, and taught at McKinley High School. I'm not an engineer, but I've promoted engineering in the high school classroom at McKinley High School and other places. I've taught my specialty as chemistry, many different levels, from action chemistry up to AP chemistry, and been very involved with the Hawaii section of the American Chemical Society, having served as chair for 2 years and president of the Hawaii Science Teachers Association and chair of the McKinley Science Department for many years. I just have a few announcements. EAH is looking for next year's program chairs. And we hope that many of you will volunteer and will be appreciated for that. Next week, our speaker will be Karen Meach, Dr. Karen Meach of the Institute for Astronomy. Her topic will be visitors from outside the solar system. She is a past TED speaker and talked about the discovery of the first interstellar object, Oumuamua, that passed through the solar system in 2017, and the second discovered 2 years later, and has a provoked, intense, sustained interest. Karen will highlight some of the remaining mysteries and controversies and what we can do in the future with regard to a space mission exploration of the next interstellar object. I and some students attended one of Karen Meach's workshops on the Big Island for a weekend, and we got up to Mauna Kea and had a lot of activities and a lot of fun, so it'll be fun to see her once again. And she is truly an outstanding speaker. You don't want to miss it. So we hope to see you next week. Okay, next, this is one of my favorite times at these meetings. It is time for a little humor from Mac McMorrow.
The EAH Humor Corner.
Yes.
Well, good thing I'm Irish, because if I offend anybody, it's going to be me. Father Murphy walks into a pub in Donegal and asks the first man he meets, "Do you want to go to heaven?" The man says, "I do, Father." The priest says, "Then stand over there against the wall." The priest then asks the second man, "Do you want to go to heaven?" "Certainly, Father," the man replies. "Then stand over there against the wall, too." Then Father Murphy walks up to O'Toole and asks, "Do you want to go to heaven?" And O'Toole says, "No, I don't, Father." The priest says, "I don't believe this. You mean to tell me that when you die, you don't want to go to heaven?" O'Toole says, "Oh, yes, when I die. I thought you were getting a group to go together right now."
Oh, thank you. All right, I've heard through the Coconut Wireless that members have really been looking forward to our speaker today. And I know Phil Blackman has been quite the advocate for getting him to speak. So at this time, I will ask Sam to introduce our speaker.
I've known Frank since I joined EAH in 1987, and he is an airport engineer for 30 or 40 years. I think he'll probably tell us that. And came over here, I think in probably the 70s, and worked for the Air Force Department, and then he worked for Parsons, and they had big projects at Honolulu International Airport and around the Pacific, which he's going to talk about. And so he has a lot of history to impart to us. Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, you're off by a few years, but to go through my background, when I got out of engineering school, I joined what was then the Bureau of Public Roads, now Federal Highways, as a junior engineer at 2 pay grades below the incoming civil engineer grade, because for 3 years we were going to be students. And I would say in those 3 years, I got a PhD in urban highway planning and in just plain highways in many, many ways. It was a tremendous experience. During that period, I went for a year on my own and a year at FAA at BPR's expense to graduate school and got a degree in urban planning. And also while there, got to work on the Penn Jersey Transportation Study, which was the first study being done on a computer. All the prior urban studies have been done with architectural and engineering drawings and things like that. When I went back to Pure Public Roads Administration, asked me to do some studies for them on aircraft impact on zones in several urban cities with the database I could get. At the end of it, they asked me if I would go to Hawaii because there were a few problems out there. So I took them up on it. It looked good to go out to Hawaii for 2 years, and that was December '66. The projects that I'm going to talk about are in this part of the world, from Hawaii, Johnson Island, Wake Island, Marshall Islands, all of Micronesia, Guam, Mariana Islands, Palau, and Yap. Also, I did work in the Philippines and worked in Taiwan, which we'll talk a little bit about. So anyway, when I got there, the first problem that Dick Puckey from the FAA gave me was to solve what was going to be done at Keahole. And what was happening at that time is the Kona Airport was literally in downtown Kona. You could walk from the airport to your hotel. Also, at 7 o'clock in the morning, it was impossible to get breakfast at any hotel because everybody had been woken up by the 2 incoming Aloha and Hawaiian planes landing at 6:30. And so at 7 o'clock, all customers were in the dining room wanting breakfast. The airport literally was that close. The state had kind of proposed going up to this place called Keahole Point. And we went up there and actually walked the site, an interesting experience. To walk the site, there was nothing but lava. We had to stay 30 feet apart because at any point somebody could fall through the thin lava crust and we'd have to send one of the 2 remaining men to get help to get them out. To say the least, it was an interesting sight. And I thought a heck of a great place to put an air. Of course, it wasn't at that time near anything. It was really out in the open. I also spent that month meeting people, but being naive to Hawaii, I didn't have any idea of who to meet. So I met people like one guy who had this little beach area with some of the greatest beaches you could ever really want to see and was planning to build this big hotel there. And another guy who was actually, I think, had a little tiny place that the only way you can get in, short of with the Jeep, was to fly in on this little tiny airstrip, was crazy landing, but we did it, and things like that. So I came back and wrote a report that not only should we move to Keahole Point, that we should lay the airport out further up the hill than right down here on the coast edge, so that there'd be room for a second runway, which we might need, and that it should be designed to be trans-Pacific. Well, to say that that shocked a few people is a minimum, because that's when I discovered the guy in the FAA who brought me out had removed 3/4 of the files on Keahole Point. The FAA, the regional director, the chief FAA guy in Washington, D.C., the head of the agencies above them, and everyone else had objected to moving Keahole Point. It just didn't make any sense. And Dick Puckey said, that's why I brought you here, because I thought we were wrong. And you're correct, we were. And the airport, as you know, has been built and is in service and is designed as a trans-Pacific. It will not need a second runway. A lot of things have changed since then. But you have to realize when I came to Hawaii, was right at the worst part of the Vietnam War, when the only planes flying across the Pacific were turboprops aircraft. The C-5A had just barely came online, and Honolulu Airport was grossly overloaded with aircraft, primarily planes trying to fly and having to stop in Hawaii because that was the only way you could get across the Pacific at the time. The company that was in charge of doing something on Big Isle was, I believe, Bechtel at the time, and the Bechtel engineer and I became friends, and I was with the FAA. And once we agreed on going to Keahole, he called me, and I worked with him very closely on different things, and he called me up and he said, what are you doing this weekend? I said, well, I don't have any big plans. Okay, you're staying over at my house. And the reason I went over to his house is when I got in there, he pulled out the plans from the architect, who had essentially no money to build an airport, a terminal building, and was literally designing a tin can. And I don't mean that negative to the architect. I think he had done a very professional job given what he was thrown. But the gentleman and I spent that weekend looking at a way we could building buildings like this with the budget we had, with absolutely nothing inside except maybe a little tiny 4x8 room that could be window air conditioned. That's what we could afford, and that's what was built there originally. And that's the buildings you look on. I believe many of them had been enclosed. They are probably air conditioned and so on and so forth today. But with the money we had, we were able to build this, and the airport get that built and open and was extended to be trans-Pacific. My next project, which he had brought me there, was the Reef Runway in Honolulu. The concept was the existing airport is here in town and flies literally over Kalihi Palama. If we could build a runway 8,700 feet out here on the reef, the planes would not be taken over town. They could turn to get out off the ocean instead of flying over downtown Waikiki. Well, could it be done? That was an interesting question. So I did a lot of study. We did end up building it, and I thought this would be an interesting one to throw in here. This is the old Reef Runway here. This is another old Reef Runway. These are runways that have been dredged before and during World War II for seaplane runways to land. They were polluted, they were horrible, and really a big mess. And so part of my design thoughts were to drain out, and we needed dredged fill. And these runways were 12 feet deep, and I didn't want to deepen them any. So we were able to start planning a dredging that would get deeper as it sloped down here, deeper as it sloped down, could dig out in here, leaving the old reef to protect the old coral, to protect the new runway, and then other dredged materials all through there. And it worked because these channels that we designed and built in here slope down enough that the normal wash coming down from the community above into the Keahole Lagoon area tended to gradually flush them out and keep anything that came in could flush out into the ocean. So it worked that way. And this is a picture of it under construction. You'll see it still hasn't all been even filled. and how it was built. One of the interesting things on that is that the bright white area is the original runway safety area, taxiway areas, all the structural areas that were needed for the airport per se. It was 14,000 feet long. The runway was 12,000 feet and would have 1,000 feet of safety area overrun on both sides. The FAA, however, wanted to change because in the old runway, you had to land, if you were flying in this direction, coming in this way, you had to land flying over town, which again wasn't a very popular thing, to say the least. So what they wanted to do was us to design the runway, which I did, so that they could land on it this way. And what they wanted in here, and you kind of sort of can see the ghost of it, was I think it was 400 or 450 feet or something of approach lights to provide the guidance for a landing at night in this direction. And so what my choice was to just build a little, maybe 100-foot wide strip out here and put the lights on it. And I realized that was going to create this sort of a bent thing here that it was going to get stuck in that. So I thought the smartest thing to do is just straighten it off at 1,400, 1,500 feet further out from the old line. That's one of these decisions you make that turn out to do something amazing. Because one day, some Philippine Airlines pilot who had a date in Manila that night started taking off, blew a tire, wasn't about to stop, blew one or two more, still wasn't, finally decided to abort because he couldn't get up speed at all. He was dragging by that point. He ended up out here, I think it was about 1,200 feet out. And if we hadn't built that extra section, that whole plane would have been totaled. They'd all have been killed. So it's an example, again, of how you make decisions to do things and they come back in your favor in the long run. But this is the runway today. And you can see how in your takeoffs, you can make as steep a turn as you want. There's nobody under you. You can swing out over the ocean, swing away from Waikiki, which is what they did, go around Diamond Head and then back, or continue to one of the other islands or back off to the west. This is another example of one of the things I did at that time. As I mentioned, the local people were not exactly happy about these planes taking off over their houses like this, which is pretty obvious. So we held a lot of meetings with the local people. And so let's say we're at a meeting today and one of you, I talk to you and I say, okay, where do you live? And you say, oh, I live right here. So I'll draw a little star. I've got a plastic overlay over the map underneath there. And on that plastic overlay, I just drew a little green star and I drew a green line where the Reef Runway is going to be. Then I moved the Reef Runway to overlay here because it was going to be the same departure path. And your star ended up here, I guess, in Lihue or somewhere. And so we'd look at the map and say, hey, if you go up to this street and this street, stand at the corner there for a couple of hours and listen to the planes going by. What you're hearing is what those planes will sound like after the Reef Runway is built when you live down here, because the planes are going to be out here instead of over your head. Those people were so in favor of the Reef Runway, they hired lawyers to go to San Francisco when opponents, the people who were environmentalists, were opposing the Reef Runway and had, a federal case going. They hired the lawyers to go to San Francisco for them, telling the court to permit building the Reef Runway. And yes, we were the first FAA project of anywhere near this size to get a formal environmental approval. And so we were able to actually build and operate the runway. The next, of course, my work was mostly at Honolulu Airport. In this position, one of the things that Owen Miyamoto wanted to do, and the Reef Runway was built with that criteria, he wanted me to build that runway. And when I say me, it wasn't me, just me personally. He wanted, our firm and everyone else working on it, to build everything for the future airplanes. And working with the Air Force and their aircraft and Boeing, we decided that the future biggest airport was probably going to be this mysterious Boeing 747 that would weigh 1.5 million pounds. Now, the recent A380 would be this Boeing airplane's life raft. I mean, it was a lot bigger than that A380, which was, I think, about 1.1 or 1.2 million at its absolute maximum. So we built this airport for that size airplane. The Reef Runway was built for that airplane. And the first overlays on the Reef Runway were only done maybe 10 years ago. It opened in October 1977. So you got quite a few years of use without doing anything to it. And in fact, you probably paid almost a quarter as much just to overlay the runway as you paid originally to build the runway, including all the embankment, shore protection, armor, and everything else. Fort Wright was rebuilt during my early years in the mid-60s to that strength. And when we redid it a few years ago, I was on this project to reconstruct it a few years ago. The people doing the structural tests couldn't figure what the heck we had done because the runway was so solid, they couldn't get any readings on their outer sensors of load testing. So yes, it was solid. These terminals, which were designed by Sam Chang with a lot of work on our part, are designed for this future 747 1.5 million pound airplane. These aprons are designed for that. It's my understanding they are still in service with relatively little major structural work. That has certainly saved, well, yes, we paid more for them than we could have, but we have certainly saved a lot more than we would have paid to keep updating them. When the A380 came on, someone in the state thought, oh my gosh, we have to tear these buildings down so we can handle that 2-story airplane. And somebody, thank goodness, called me and we couldn't, you guys realize this building is designed for 2-level loading, notice? And all of a sudden they woke up and sure enough, they expanded this building to accommodate the A380 with 2nd floor loading and everything else. It was designed, planned and designed when it was built in 1970s for that loads. So it's been a great experience, and Honolulu, I think, has gained a lot out of it and is still able to make use of it. One of the other airports in Hawaii that was always an interesting one to me was Lihue, because I kind of like Lihue. It's an interesting and a nice island. The problem at this airport, this is, and I don't know if this is the new extension and the new terminal, if this is the old one, but either way, the terminal was in this relation to the threshold, and assuming this is the threshold, and if it was down here, so be it, the plane literally has to fly inside the mountain in here, come around tight, and somehow get down here. That is not one of the nicer landings a pilot likes to make. I had proposed, and everybody shot it down for all kinds of reasons, that we ought to build another runway that for landing and things like that. And now we can't do that because they'll use it to take off, and that goes out over town, which it does. But sure enough, they did. And this is the only photo I found recently, but this is the airport while it's under construction. This is the old runway. This may be the old terminal. This may be the terminal in the photo just out, I don't know. But the point is that this is now the takeoff runway, which does take off over the ocean. And this is the landing runway, which does land over the ocean. No flying around mountains, no circling. A beautiful airport with a design that allows you to operate in both directions with minimum of difficulty. So this has been a great fun project also. At any rate, I don't know what else there is. If we want to talk about anything, we can.
In Part 2, Frank covers the development of airports in Majuro Atoll, Kozri Island, Pohnpei, Truk, and Guam. Frank finishes with talking about developing airports in Saipan, Yap, Palau, Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and Taipei, Taiwan.
Engineers and architects of Hawaii welcome your comments on this program and any of our recent programs. We encourage your direct participation in this community outreach. So please email us your comments and ideas at eahawaii@gmail.com.